I don't want to talk. And I don't want to listen. It's January 2009 and I'm on a hike. I'm in Rajasthan in India. And I feel grumpy. I feel lonely. I feel devastated. It's just one of these days. And I don't feel like talking to anyone. And to make sure I don't have to talk, I left my communication device back at the hostel. And without it, I'm sure I will not listen and I will not talk, and I will certainly not do what I call haptical listening. So what is haptical listening? To understand that, we have to go back even one more year. So now it's 2008. And the company I worked for at the time closed. I was fired. And I decided to invest the whole severance package from the company plus all my savings to buy a ticket, around the world ticket. So 6 months, just me and my backpack around the world. And for a reason I cannot even recall, I also packed this little chalkboard. It was new then, now it looks a bit worn. And this became my communication device. So, big display size, amazing battery life. And soon after starting my journey, I developed what I call haptical listening, and it goes like this. So, whenever I met a stranger along my way, I offered the chalkboard and asked the question, what is your word of the day? I watched the other person think. I watched her write, listening to the noise of the chalk on the board while trying to stand the silence. So I was not used to silence in conversations. And finally, that other person handed me back the board. I grasped it, so I literally held the answer in my hand. I read it, turned it around and asked, what's the story behind it? This is what I call haptical listening. So, did it work to ask random stranger for a personal story out of their life? Oh yes, absolutely. I collected hundreds of portrait photos, I asked permission for them by the way, of people holding up my chalkboard with a word, and even more important, with story. And this pile became my treasure. But it took me a long time to value that treasure, actually more than 10 years. It took me more than 10 years, and at some point while, browsing through this stack, I suddenly saw a pattern very related to the topic of today's event, against the odds. And I invite you to meet a few of the people I met. Listen to their stories, and I'm curious what patterns you will see. So, for the first story, we go to South Africa, to Soweto, the big city right beside Johannesburg where I was staying. This time, the chalkboard made just the entry to the story because it connected me to the housemaid of the hostel I was staying. Her name was Ntombi. And she said she lived in Soweto and she offered me to show me around in her neighborhood. And I was delighted. So we strolled through Soweto and we crossed an area consisting only of small shacks made out of tin. A little bit further in, the tin shacks made way to a lot of concrete foundations. And I learned it was a government project to provide basic housing to the people of Soweto, but it ran out of money. So they built just a few brick houses and a lot of empty concrete foundations with no houses on top. And most of them were already used as garbage dumps. But one was different. The property was all clean, and so was the foundation. Still no house on top, just the foundation. And this is where I met her. She was doing the dishes. We started talking. And she said, I have no idea whether the government will ever finish my house. But you know what? I found a way to cope with the waiting time. Then she pointed at the concrete foundation and said, I already started to do the dishes at exactly the spot where the kitchen will be. And what looked like a humble habit was quite the opposite for me. It was one of the most visionary things I've ever seen. This woman was keeping the vision alive for a better future in Soweto. So this gesture was like saying, you can deny me decent housing, but you can't take away my dignity. This woman for me was a kind of a role model of how to fight against the odds. From South Africa, we go to Brazil. A few weeks later, I was sitting in a cafe in a city called Salvador de Bahia, and across the street was a little boy, maybe 6 to 8 years old, and obviously a homeless boy. I could tell by the few belongings and the dirty blanket right beside him. And we started communicating. I was drawing funny animals on my chalkboard and showed it to him across the street. He was smiling, and finally he came close. And we used the chalkboard as a communication device. So I drew his hand on the board. I wrote down his name, Aliso. And by the way, the black bar is because I don't speak Portuguese and couldn't ask permission for my travel blog. And it was a wonderful communication until the waiter showed up and shooed Aliso away like some wild animal. And Aliso looked scared, and I was speechless at first. And then I said, hey, stop it, Aliso is with me. And I was furious. And then I realized it was my chalkboard, and drawing Aliso's hand on it, what made Aliso visible to me and to that waiter. Because people like Aliso are supposed to be invisible to us. We pretend not to see them because they are stains on our perfect little worlds. They are fighting against the odds in plain sight. But most of the time I pretend not to see them, and I almost never ask for their stories. Drawing Aliso's hand on my board made him visible to me. At least for a while, and for sure in this moment now. From Brazil to the Middle East, Jordan. I was spending a few days exploring these ancient ruins of Petra, magnificent ancient city hidden beneath rocks. And one day, I tried an alternative route into the city in a dry riverbed, and big signs stating, oh, this is a difficult hike, only for experienced trekkers, it's climbing involved. And I feel confident enough. And at the trailhead, I met an old man. He was waiting there, maybe 70 years old, bald head, one of these gray grandpa coats, and a black granddad purse. And he introduced himself as Bernard from Belgium. And he asked me whether he can join me on this hike. And I was torn. On the one hand, the last thing I wanted was a granddad in an old coat slowing me down. On the other hand, I was afraid he might go on his own. So I agreed, saying, yeah, of course, let's do this together, Bernard. And that's what we did. It was a difficult hike. So we have to climb up and down, surrounding rocks. And then a strange thing happened. I expected Bernard to be behind me, trying to keep up out of breath. But he was in front of me. So he was dancing across the rocks. Sometimes he was almost running, grinning this poor jaw. Look at the upper left. So he was almost running. He behaved like kind of a young mountain goat. And at some point he even gave me a hand, helping me crossing over rocks. And I was speechless and breathless. And in the next break, I offered him my chalkboard and he wrote, "A day for good trekkers." And boy, was he right. Of course, I asked him, "Bernard, why are you such a good trekker?" And he said, "Yeah, it's a long way from Belgium, you get used to it." And I said, "Wait a minute, what do you mean, long way from Belgium?" And he told me he had this funny idea of spending Christmas in Bethlehem in Palestine and to just walk there on his own, all the way. And that's what he did. So he really made it to Bethlehem, and by the time he liked hiking so much that he just went on, ending up in a dry riverbed in Jordan with me. And looking at him now, I'm still kind of embarrassed that I not only judged a book by its cover, I judged a human being by the color of his coat. Bernard was not only an inspiring man dancing against the odds of getting old, he was also a mountain goat in disguise. But not all his stories have been that uplifting, far from that. I remember one situation in a bus station somewhere in the United States. I was sitting next to an old man and he looked very sad. So we started talking and finally I offered him my chalkboard. He hesitated at first and then he wrote, "Broke and frustrated." And almost with tears he told me that he's on his way to his son, to ask his son for money again because he screwed up again. The sentence that stuck the most was, "I'm not supposed to ask my son for money. It should be the other way around. It's not right what I'm doing." Though this man was clearly losing this particular fight against the odds. Sometimes the odds just win, probably way more often than I notice. Look at them. Different human beings, different continents. Did you notice a pattern? Here's what I saw. All of them looked like ordinary people at first to me, until I listened to their stories that turned them into fighters against the odds. Though the world around me is full of those stories, and it's fighting against the odds what creates most of the stories. And that's those stories that make us human. It's our stories that make us human. And sometimes it takes only one question for a word of the day to bring that stories to life. It took me a journey around the world and a chalkboard to realize that I actually don't need a chalkboard and a journey around the world because I have an abundance of valuable connections right in front of me at any time. Sometimes it's as easy as asking for a single word. It's listening to seemingly ordinary stories what turned this pile into a treasure for me. You know what? I'm sure you have such a treasure too, right? I realized one more thing. You see that red spot? That's for India. And we are back at the beginning of my talk. I'm still on my hike in Rajasthan to this viewpoint called Toad Rock. Finally, I reached the top. Beautiful scenery, but I'm still grumpy. I don't want to talk, but there's this little boy. He's approaching me. He makes fun of me. He asks me funny questions, and I can't help but to answer him again and again and again. And we sit down and we talk for more than 2 hours. We talk about how to be a child in India and in Germany, how to fly a kite in India and in Germany, We talk about our favorite songs, and in the end we sing songs together. It seems like this little guy is handing me an invisible chalkboard all the time. And when I leave Toad Rock, I'm smiling. I'm smiling because I was wrong. I do want to talk today. This little boy told me, he showed me that it's not only about the stories I ask for, it's also about the stories I dare to share for myself. So my own chalkboard stories count as well. And hey, maybe I'm now part of the treasure pile of this little boy. He might be in his 20s now. I can't share the magic of Toad Rock, of these 2 hours with you, but I can share 30 seconds of the song this boy sang to me, and I invite you to listen.
Vindai Machala Yamuna Ganga Utvala Jala Sitaranga Tava Shubha Name Jage Tava Shubha Ashish Mange Gaye Tabu Jaya Gata Janagan Mangal Dayak Bharat Bhagya Vidata Jaya He Jaya He Jaya 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 He.
Thank you.